All right. Thank you all so much for joining us today for this very important conversation. I'm Zachary Draves of Team NBS, and we are joined by special guest Dr. Letitia Brown from Virginia Tech University. And we are here to co-host a panel discussion on athletes and mental health. And when we think of mental health, generally athletes are not often included in the conversation or even talked about. But today we are going to include this space where athletes can make their voices be heard, especially now as May is Mental Health Awareness Month. Welcome to our conversation.
Happy to be here.
All right, so we're going to break it down into various topics throughout this entire program. And one of the first topics that we're going to talk about is the issue of trauma in the world of sports. So as a result of that, we have some very special guests with us today to discuss these various topics. But to talk about the issue of trauma, let's bring on our guests for today. We have here Reggie Walker, Dr. Emmett Gill, and Marvin B. Cornish Jr. Welcome, gentlemen.
Welcome. So, my first question for anyone in the group to answer is that we know how difficult it is for men in general to discuss trauma, let alone men of color to discuss trauma in public. How have you come to your own ability to be able to express what has happened to you, and what do you feel you offer to the world by doing so?
I can take that first, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I think, well, what I have to offer is, well, could you just tell me a little bit about the first question again?
Yes, thinking about how difficult it is for men to open up about having experienced their own trauma, and especially men of color and Black men in particular, because there's this idea that African Americans are resilient and strong.
Okay.
And yes.
It was my fault. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So just to the first part of that question, how difficult it is. So I'll just kind of give you a little story. I got molested when I was younger for about 6 to 7 years. I didn't really talk about it or start dealing with it until probably my junior year of college. And then when I finally got to the point where, after a lot of therapy, where I was okay with actually telling other people what happened, it was during my NFL career, maybe my fourth year. And when I started having these conversations with other players on a team, the thing that shocked me the most was I would tell them these heavy amounts of trauma that I went through: physical abuse, sexual abuse, mental abuse. And whoever I told it to, I always asked them, like, they would always tell me that, yes, something like that happened to me too. And I always made sure I asked them how often, like, how many times have you said this to someone? And they always, 100% of the time, told me that was the first time I've ever said it.
Yes.
And the thing that most people don't understand is high school football compared to college football, there's a huge jump, and it's a huge jump, because not just mental, because you're asked to do more difficult things mentally, but it's the mentality has changed. You're dealing with older people. The whole mentality behind it's different, and then when you make that jump to the NFL, it changes again, and now you're dealing with people who is like. This is, I have to be clear about this because I wanted people to understand what's going on with someone's mental while they're doing this. Like, I played football because I thought it was going to bring me happiness because I was miserable. All the abuse I'd gone through, I would go out and play football. I'd be the angriest person I could think of, and it was encouraged. And because deep down, I was using this anger to go get happiness. And when I get to the NFL, you're dealing with all types of people who are literally using football to do the same thing. So you could only imagine where someone could be at. mentally because it's they're using football as a means to an end.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
As a means to kind of cover up the trauma and express the trauma in an acceptable way.
In an acceptable way, yeah, because when I had said things about like little bits here and there to people about some things that had happened to me, it didn't go over too well. When I first went to therapy, when I first got to college, it didn't go over too well. So I didn't bring these things up again.
No.
Until I got into a place where there's a safe space created, if you could say, which was really around other football players. Or the thing that I found, or military people. I feel like people who understand the mentality the best are military people or other football players. Or
let me jump on at that point. I work full time at the Department of Veterans Affairs, and a lot of times I compare, and I'm a military veteran myself. So military and athletics in a lot of ways have similarities. And the biggest example of that I use is what Reggie was talking about. I call it the gladiator mentality. So in the military, we're dealing a lot with service members and veterans who have PTSD. The first day of basic training, we're taught that we are the most lethal fighting force in the world. That doesn't equate to any type of weakness, if you think about it, right? So if I report to my commander and say, "Hey, I'm not feeling well. I don't feel like myself," there's that fear that the commander is going to be like, "Oh, really? You're not feeling good today? Oh, you want to go back to your tent and rest your head, put your feet up while somebody else takes your place on patrol?" Okay, that's the mentality. So now fast forward to athletics. I've seen in situations where you say something to a coach about being injured, and they may say, "Okay, go over there by the trainer for the rest of practice," as if that's where the weak area is. So therefore, when you add a third factor into that, as far as the African American community, we're taught to either pray it away, or as older adults, we'll go to happy hour and talk to the barroom lawyer about whatever's going on. But you're never steered necessarily towards sitting down with someone and talking through therapy.
Yes, and that's a major issue within the Black community, is the stigma against sharing your issues because you don't want to put your dirty laundry out there for others to hear, essentially.
That is definitely true. And I wanted to follow up with Reggie for a moment and just ask you, as you were climbing up the ladder with your playing career, did you ever have any moment where you felt safe? Did you ever have any sort of safe space? I know you mentioned you started therapy around that time, but did you have any other safe spaces that you can go to?
My house. Luckily, my wife. Being home was probably like my safe space. I had a couple buddies, handful that I could talk to, and that really helped. But for the most part, it was like being in a war zone, a mental war zone, because how professional sports is, especially pro football. It is what it is. It's you're operating in a world full of snakes. So when it comes to trust or letting your guard down, no, never. You could never do that, especially when anything could get you out of there. And this is your dream, and you sacrifice so much to get here. So you're extra paranoid. You're paranoid. Yeah, paranoia. The anxiety levels, the stress levels, they're high. So, and you stay in it. The craziest part about it was when I got done and I finally realized, towards my 7th year that it was done, it was over. And then when I made the step to retire and try to, get out of this mentality, it took me years to get out of it. And it was shocking because you're so used to, like, how I'd explain to my wife is I'm used to going dun 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 all the time, and then regular life is dun 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 dun, and you have longer goal. Everything changes. So, yeah, and then when it comes to people, I'll put it when you've seen some of the things that a lot of athletes have seen, the higher you go up when it comes to people and what people would do to get what they want out of things, you just can't look at people the same anymore. You can't. It's impossible to look at people the exact same as before. And I still work on it now, but no, it's very difficult.
I just wanted to add something. First of all, I need your help, Zach. So am I looking at the camera?
Yes.
Yes, you are. Yes, you are, Emmett.
Because mine is sort of going like this, but I think that one of the things that we do is we think about trauma, and rightfully so. We think about issues of sexual abuse. We think about domestic violence, but there's this continuum, and so we think about this idea of adverse childhood experiences, and I sometimes say adverse adolescent experiences, and those can exist on a continuum. It can be that sexual abuse. On the other hand, it could be gunshots in the neighborhood that you're used to hearing. It could be food insecurity. It could be a divorce. It could be a lot of different things that cause trauma. And as we sort of go back to the question, why do we have challenges with this? Is oftentimes we don't recognize it as challenges. Recognize it as trauma. Sometimes in our communities of color, we think that seeing a friend murdered is normal. We think about the violence that we might see on the street corner, that we might hear in the apartment down the hall as normal. Those are traumatic events. So part of the problems or the challenges or the barriers that we have in terms of having conversations about it is because as Black men and Black women and people of color, we really don't take time to recognize that as a traumatic life event. Some of these things aren't normal, but we normalize them. And therefore, like Marvin was saying, sometimes we just think that we can, pray these things away, or we can drink these things away, or we can smoke these things away. When, as Reggie alluded to, therapy is a key component of that.
Definitely, and that leads to this question that can be for all of you, given your extensive backgrounds and expertise in addressing the issue of trauma. How would you recommend the sports world address the critical issue of trauma, and as a way to better support athletes?
I think first and foremost, we need more Reggies. Education is key. So many people look up to athletes for whatever reasons, role models, they want to follow our footsteps or whatever the case may be. So when you look at somebody like Tyson Fury, who came out not recently, I saw on a documentary where he said that he was diagnosed as manic depressive, and spoke about how after he had won the championship, he's sitting there at the press conference, and he was depressed. He was sad, and he had just won the world championship. So education first and foremost, and not hesitating to share your stories, worried about what people may think of you. You have to know who you are first and foremost. And when you stick to that concept, the rest of it becomes easy for you.
Yeah, I would piggyback on what Marvin is saying. I think that's sort of incredible. We definitely need a champion in terms of having conversations with athletes about trauma. I'll go to college athletics. And I'll talk about a few things. First of all, or not too many things, but first of all, I think the challenge is that we need to recognize that trauma exists. It's educating practitioners about trauma. So often we're focused on depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, bipolar disorders, disordered eating, but trauma is real, and we're sort of behind the times in terms of thinking about trauma, just as when we were behind the times we were thinking about traumatic brain injury, and so one, we need to educate practitioners. Two, we need more practitioners of color out there who understand what trauma is all about. And, the reality is right now, when we look at the Power 5 conferences, about 70% of the practitioners are white. And when we break that down, of that 70%, about 90 of those are white women. And I'm not saying that white women or white men can't do therapy with, black male football players and basketball players and track athletes, but the reality is, when you have that sort of cultural relativity, that cultural sensitivity, that cultural competence, then those things are on your mind. I was talking with a practitioner at a Power 5 conference school, and she had spoken to a colleague, and the colleague didn't understand why the student athlete couldn't go home. They had no clue about their environment and what was going on in their environment. So 1, we need more champions like Reggie. 2, we need to educate others. But 3, and it's something that Reggie alluded to, and then I'll defer to my colleagues here. But it's really whether or not coaches want athletes to deal with that trauma. Because coaches want those athletes to play angry.
Yes.
So if they start going to therapy and they're all touchy-feely and they get in touch with themselves, maybe they're not as aggressive on the field. Maybe they're not as focused on athletics. And then they're messing with the coach's money and they're messing with the monsters on the field. And so we really have to ask ourselves, if we do steps 1 and 2, is step 3, the role that coaches play in all of this, is that going to get in the way of athletes receiving the help that they need? Because you got to wonder, why do athletes experience all these charges after they leave college? Why haven't they gotten help while they're in college?
Yeah, if I could just touch on what Emmett said really quickly, I think a lot of these things need to be addressed as far back as high school. I go back again to Mike Tyson. When I think about the Lennox Lewis press conference, and again, looking at that documentary, Mike was on medications, but again, as a boxer, you're supposed to be aggressive. So if you're on some type of mood medication that's going to reduce your aggressiveness, you're not going to be a successful boxer. So apparently they had taken him off of his medication, maybe even unbeknownst to him, prior to that Lennox Lewis fight. And if you look at that press conference, they had the 2 areas where both of the boxers were going to walk up underneath this, spotlight. And it was almost like you were releasing a pit bull off the chain when Mike walked up to his spot. It was like he couldn't wait for Lennox Lewis to get to his, and then he automatically goes over there. They get into the fight, so on and so forth. And then you see him completely melt down when, somebody in the audience yelled he needed to be put in a straitjacket. He just went completely off. And when you listen to some of the things that he was saying, it's almost like you could see his childhood playing out right in front of you if you knew how to dissect what he was talking about.
Yeah. I have to talk about this too. I'm so sorry. Emmett made a lot of points too, but I want to go back to something that Emmett had said about we need to acknowledge that trauma exists. It's as far as I can look back at all the locker rooms I've been in, and you're going to have somebody who's dealt with mental, physical, or sexual abuse for sure. You're going to have people who've dealt with mass poverty on a great scale. Mother, father gone, and them using that energy to guide them towards the point that they're trying to get to. But we do need to understand that it exists. But also too, being a man of color and being an athlete, the thing that I understood with my whole path in therapy was there is a huge disconnect with athletes and therapists and people of color and therapists. Because this, a lot of the issues that I'm just going to speak on pro football players that they're dealing with when they retire, we're all basically the same guy. We all have the same issues we're dealing with. I talk to wives and they're all married to the same husband. And when I talk to these guys about going to therapy, the thing that they always say is they don't get it. They don't get it. They don't understand the context of what you mean when you're saying these things. When you're talking about like, oh, when I went out and played, it was war. That guy was trying to kill me. They're looking at it as, oh, it was a game.
Yeah.
No, and just like I told you, once it goes up from high school to college to NFL, oh, people are really trying to get that in now. Now they see the finish line, and it's life. They're putting their lives on the line. So when you're out there seeing guys wrestle on a block and thinking it's fun and games and camaraderie, it's not. Like, this guy's trying to take money out of my kid's mouth, and he's trying to hurt me, and I got to hurt him. That's what it is. And he's not going to get me, and I'm not. All I know is at the end of the day, it's not going to be me. And everyone has that mentality. At the end of the day, I know it's not going to be me. 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 And then when you talk to a therapist, I remember I've talked to therapists, and they've talked about. I remember she said that I had an issue with being paranoid when I would discuss some of the things that happened in my football career, and I had to tell her ahead of time. I know what I'm about to say. It's going to sound like it, but you have to understand this is just what the environment is. Mm-hmm. You literally have to watch everything you do. You're under the spotlight all the time.
Yeah.
So, yeah, but we do need more therapists who are former athletes. More former athletes as therapists, more people of color especially, but we do need more men counselors too, because I've probably talked to one male counselor or a therapist, and I've been going to counseling for the last 10 years.
Thank you, gentlemen. Like, everything that you've said resonates, and we could spend a trillion hours talking about trauma because there's so much trauma in everything. But unfortunately, we have to move on to the next segment. But I want to thank you all for your insights and for what you shared. And I hope that we can keep this conversation going at another time because it's so important. Thank you.
Thank you, fellas.
Thank you.
All right. So yeah, there's so much to take in, and we only have so much time, but it's such an important topic. And one of the things that was brought up was obviously addressing the issue of trauma early on, and really focusing on all levels of sport. And that leads us into our next topic, which is on student athletes and mental health. And we also got another tremendous panel of experts to join us for this particular conversation. So we got Trey Moses, we got Kelly Mondurnino. I hope I pronounced your last name right. Marvin is still going to stick around for this particular conversation. Welcome all. Marvin, glad you're sticking with us. And Trey and Kelly, welcome to our discussion.
Yes.
All right, so just kind of get into the first question, and this could be to anyone who wants to answer first. Given where we're at right now with the COVID-19 pandemic, many student athletes are really going through an identity crisis in a lot of ways, trying to figure out, who they are and how they see themselves. Can you explain what that can look like, what that period can look like where a student athlete is really trying to figure out who they are in the midst of this crisis?
Yeah, I can take that first question. So I actually just graduated a year ago from Central Michigan, where I was a Division I lacrosse player. So in a roundabout way, not similar to COVID, but I'm kind of going through that experience of, okay, I played, this sport at a certain level for 10 plus years. And now, I can't go pro, and that's not an option for me. So now what does my life look like? And navigating that is not the easiest, because I definitely still have that student athlete mentality of, okay, my summer is meant setting goals and trying to reach a certain level of physical fitness so that, when I take my fitness test, in the fall, I'm fit and ready to go. And now it's okay, I'm entering into my adulthood life. I'm in a graduate program, trying to become a professional and navigating a whole set of different things and having to redefine, what does being an athlete look like to me? And it's not easy. It's definitely my background with kind of the stuff I struggled with as a student athlete with my mental health. definitely resurfaced after graduating, and has been a difficult transition, just trying to figure out, okay, what do I want physical fitness to look like for me, and how does my identity play a role, and do I still see myself as an athlete? Am I just, and we had the term like NARP, non-athletic person. Am I that now, and how to define myself as that? So.
I would say for me, I was just in Australia playing professionally, and only there 12 days and got sent home. So it was a tough transition for me. I would say I was kind of in that situation as far as, being a student athlete, even though I'm not in school. But I've had my moments early on during all of this where it was really tough for me. But I've really focused on, figuring out who I am outside of basketball. Eventually, your sport is going to end. You can't play basketball forever, football forever, whatever sport, you cannot play that forever. So anytime I talk to athletes, I'm questioning, who are you outside of your sport? And I hate that it's taken, something like COVID to really push that question out there and force us to figure that out. Because as athletes, I feel like we should be working on that while we're even playing sport throughout the season. I know it's a little tougher, but who are you outside of sport? What are you passionate about? What do you love outside of, the game? And for me, I've read more books in, the couple months in COVID than I probably did all 4 years in college, in books that I didn't have to read. And so I'm really challenging myself to be more than just an athlete, especially during a time like this.
One of the things that whenever we have recruits come in, one of the first questions I'll ask is, what's your credit score? And as I'm asking the different student athletes, they'll say, well, I don't understand. I'll cut them off and I'll move on to another one. I'm like, what's your credit score? And they're like, well, I don't have a job. Oh, okay, I'll go away from that one. I'm like, what's your credit score? What I'm talking about is anybody outside of your family, coaches, or teammates who would be willing to vouch for you as a person. So what I've challenged a lot of student athletes that I work with to do during this time is to strengthen relationships. Strengthen relationships, because that then takes them away from concentrating so much on something that they've lost, especially, my senior student athletes who were about to go into, postseason play and so on and so forth, and that's been cut. A lot of them were hoping that postseason play would strengthen their, opportunities maybe to play on pro level, things along that line, and now that's been stripped away. So I said, one thing when you're home, you can't run away from you. You have to take a look in the mirror and ask yourself, who am I? I told some players also, you want to start next year. You're upset that you didn't get the playing time you wanted. Now's the time for you to go back and do an inventory, self-inventory. What could I have done differently? Don't wait on your coaches to tell you. Go to them with the feedback and say, you know what, when I was in cover 2, I really should have been over here. I see where I failed on that play, and this is what I've been doing to improve. But, Trey said something important, that loss of identity, and that's what I continue seeing with a lot of my student athletes, is their identity is so attached to their sport that without it, they're circling what I call circling the drain. It's going from one thing into the next, into the next. It's affecting their schoolwork, their confidence level. Because now that you switch to online classes, I've had some student athletes that just threw in the towel and said, forget it, I'm not even coming back to school. I can't do it. And I had to tell them, rely. Where's that confidence that you have when you're on the court or when you're on the field? How do you build that confidence? Use that same thing, use those same tools right now.
Yeah, and that kind of leads me to my question about the transitions and the movement from high school to college and college to the next level, and kind of what supports are there in place, because student athletes, there's this idea from the general college perception that, oh, they think they're so great, they think they're so big, but they're not taking into consideration the amount of practice, travel, play that these students are going through. And as a former student and current professor, I hear a lot of faculty say things like, oh, I hate it when I have athletes in my class. And it's just really disheartening because they're putting in so much effort and so much work. And as faculty, I feel like it's our responsibility to protect and take care of all of our students and to not judge them based on whether they're here academically for athletics, and to consider the different circumstances from which all of our students come from.
I'll jump in first. One of the things we do at Bowie State is the first day of training camp for football, I do what's called a Bulldog Rookie Symposium, where we talk about that actual transition. And to the point where we tell them, you sit in the front of the class, you sit in the back, because we want you to show your professors that you're serious about your classwork. We, one of the biggest things we try to remove is that stigma that's attached to our student athletes, that everything is given to us and we have a feeling of entitlement, because we do have a certain sense of confidence and arrogance that goes along with being an athlete that you have to be successful. But we talk to them about time management. There's no reason that you should be missing class, missing assignments, because the first day of class, what are you given? A syllabus of everything that's going to take place. It's time to let go of mommy and daddy's hand, or your favorite teacher in high school to let you float through. Now's when you become a man. Now's when you become a woman, because it's up to you to control your own destiny at this point. So we focus a lot on accountability with our incoming freshmen.
It's wonderful.
That was something that Ball State did as well. As all the freshman athletes that have to be there in the summer, so football, basketball, I think it was softball, a couple other sports, like we had to do like freshman stuff all together. We had to take all of our classes we took in the summer were together. So I thought it was super cool that they allowed us to not only one, get to know each other as freshmen, but two, they showed us how it's going to be. Like you said, they talked to us about, expectations in the classroom, sit in the front of the class, show your professors you care. And it is frustrating as student athletes to have that kind of stigma around us that we don't care. Because I know for myself, I want to be a future educator, and not that I necessarily loved school, but I loved what I was planning on doing. And so this idea that we don't care and we only care about our sports is super frustrating, because I feel like whether it's social media, whether it's professors, whatever it is, we're constantly getting bashed and have this stigma around us that we don't care. In reality, most of us do care. Most of us care about our future and what we plan to do outside of sport.
Yeah. Thank you. And Kelly, I was hoping to hear from you, because there's often a lot of differential talk about male athletes versus female athletes, and who cares more academically and who shows up more, and just thinking about the stigma against different sports. So basketball, football, nobody likes them apparently, but they love them when they bring in the money. But then we don't hear things about lacrosse or soccer, especially when they're female dominated sports. So I just like to hear your take kind of on what your transition was like.
Yeah, so Central Michigan, when I joined, actually was the first year of the program. So when I graduated, my class was the first to graduate from the program altogether. So being an emerging sport, it was very difficult to begin with, because you have women's soccer and all those other dominating women's basketball that do really well. And then to start a new program, it's okay, well, the assumption is you're kind of going to suck, that, you're bringing in all, 28 freshmen. How are you going to do well? We actually ended up doing very well. I can't remember our record, but we won quite a bit of games and kind of showed that, hey, we're here to make a mark. And when it came to our fall ball games and some of that stuff, a lot of the girls had great relationships with more of the male sports. So it kind of brought in the conversation of okay, this is, a legit sport. We're here to be competitive. And we actually had a lot of support more from football than a lot of the other sports or people on campus, just with the relationships that our girls had made with those outside of our sport. With it being an emerging program, there's a lot of weight on it, financially speaking, that, okay, we're going to support this program. You want to see it do well. But then also all of us that, committed to the program, we had a lot of losses, a lot of girls transferred and, went places that meant where they were right to be. And then we had, I think it was 12 of us at the end that stuck with it. And just kind of the relationships that you make outside of your team in the program is kind of where the support came, and we had people look at us a little bit differently. Okay, we are female, but we had a lot of male support, athletically speaking.
Definitely, and then one of the things that people should understand a lot more, really take a look at, is that how student athletes get so much out of being around their teammates and their coaches. I mean, we all think of that as common sense, but we don't think of it often within the context of the sports that, are seen as the non-revenue generating sports. And then, there has to be really sort of a look at, or sort of a reevaluation about how we view sport. And given where we're at right now with COVID, there seems to be in some circles a push to really, get sports back up and running as soon as possible, but not necessarily taking into consideration the overall physical and mental health of the athletes themselves. So just given, this is a question for everybody on the panel, but just sort of given your expertise and your experiences, how would you all recommend athletic departments pursue going forward, reopening, if you will, while maintaining a certain priority of the athlete's mental health and physical health?
I'll jump in first. It's something that we're working on, as we stated, as well. I think the mental health piece is going to be key. And I know a lot of schools already have counseling services on campus, but I think there needs to be some counseling services specific to the athletic department, because our student athletes are just different in how they go about, their routines and so on and so forth. One of the things that you're running across, some of the seasons may be shortened. We've already lost spring ball. You're not quite sure when training camp is even going to start. So some of the things that you're going to run across are going to be fear of injury, because you haven't had that time as a team to really build up. Loss of competition, meaning if I'm maybe a senior athlete that's trying to go to the pros, now I might not have as much good film as I really need to make that difference. So that anxiety is going to be on me. Also, believe it or not, playing in front of possibly no fans in the stands. And there's talk of maybe games being live streamed so that your family still and supporters get to see you play. But something as far as playing in front of fans, there's a motivation behind that as well that you could possibly lose, which then detracts from your concentration, which then makes you more susceptible to an injury. So some of those things are key, but I definitely feel like there has to be some alternative offerings when it comes to what I call mental wellness. I don't say mental health, I say mental wellness. That's part of that, removing the stigma that I'm trying to work, within athletics. But I think there needs to be, like, Trey was saying, maybe some therapists that are former athletes, so that they understand our mindset, they understand our routine, because athletes have expectations.
Yes.
That are different than your average college student.
Thank
Definitely.
you.
I think taking all that into consideration is big, but my biggest thing, especially being an educator, was the fear of students and student athletes being in situations at home that are very toxic for them.
Yes.
So for me, I came home in my last 2 years. This is the longest I've been home in probably 3 years. And I'm very blessed that I'm in a good situation, but not everyone's like me. There are going to be student athletes that are in terrible situations that they were praying to get out of by going to college. And now you put them there for 2 or 3 months. We definitely need counselors for our student athletes, because they might have went through some trauma at home. They might have went through whatever it was at home. And now, they're coming back to college, and it's like, how do they get rid of everything they just went through?
Yeah. And then there's the question of how we're even going to bring people back to universities at this point. And there are so many vulnerable people, student athletes, general population, staff, faculty, and it's just COVID-19 has changed the world as we know it. And it's changed sports as we know it. Mm-hmm. What are the protections that we can put into place? Because as much as I love sports, I don't want the people that I love that are athletes on the field to be exposed in a way that's unsafe for them. And so there's just a lot to consider.
And Dr. Brown, one of the things that hasn't really been talked about as well, I'm just going to piggyback off of some of what Trey said when it comes to your environments at home.
Yes.
One thing that we're addressing is the fact that our student athletes that maybe have an alternate lifestyle, lifestyle, that on campus, that was their safe place because they were accepted. But now that they've been home,
it's no longer safe.
You know, outside of maybe trying to escape some other traumas at home that were taking place and trying to hide their identity. Now they've been home for, 2-3 months, whatever the case may be. Coming back to campus may not even be that safe place for them at that point because their mentality, their mindset has been damaged so much. So again, I'm all for, we need to have mental wellness staff specifically for athletics to help them navigate through a lot of what, may have taken place, be it food insecurities, could be homelessness. We did a survey for our student athletes at Bowie State, and I had some responses that said they were so depressed they didn't even get out of bed. Loss of their sport was how they got their stress, were able to get over their stress and as an outlet, and that their home life became terrible because now there's no outlet for them, and that mom or that dad or the other two siblings that are sharing my room just became too much.
For sure. It has to be done on an institutional level, and it has to be done on a personal and individual level. All those things have to be working in tandem to make sure that there is that effectiveness, and making sure that we let the athletes know that we're here for them and we see them and we can create space for them to be heard. There's so much that we can talk about, but we're going to make the transition to our next panel. But we want to thank all of you for joining in on this discussion. It's very, very powerful, and let's keep the conversation going. And we admire all the work that each of you are doing. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
All right. So there's just so many factors to consider, on so many levels. And that's what leads us to what was said earlier about sort of the intersections of trauma, overall mental health or mental wellness, as Marvin said, and really trying to factor in how it intersects with race and gender. And that leads us to our next discussion, where we are having Emmett come back. And also joining us is Dr. Akila Carter-Francisque. I hope I got your last name right. Francine. Okay. Thank you both for joining us for this discussion. Just going ahead and talking about how the intersections of race and gender play out. Question for anyone who wants to answer first, just sort of looking at COVID-19 and the disproportionate effect it's having on communities of color. How does that impact male and female student athletes of color?
I guess I'll start out. One of the things is, and most of my research really lines up around looking at women, Black female collegiate athletes in particular. And some of the challenges that are really sort of coming to head at this moment are with COVID-19, or just understanding some of the historical and cultural traits and characteristics that, and I'm going to add myself into that equation because I was a former student athlete as well, but the responsibility from a gendered perspective for Black women. And we are also often known as sort of the caretaker, and we do things to provide service, not only within our families, but also within our surrounding communities. And so for some of those young women moving back home, the responsibility may have increased to the point that now they're having to manage themselves, their families, their academic involvement, and then balancing all the nuances of the transition into being back at home and managing being, again, that athlete, if they are able to train or aren't able to train, and how that all speaks to their day-to-day reality. And so for many of them, that increased responsibility has probably been an additional weight on them during this time.
Yeah, and I'll just add, and it's good to see you this morning, Akila.
Good to see you.
You know, I think a lot of the things we've talked about, but you know, I'm going to shift for a minute to something positive, and that's, you know, some of our males, you know, are going back into their communities and their homes, and they balance work and they balance school. You know, they found the opportunities to provide additional income for their families. They provided support for family members who may have lost employment because of COVID-19. They stepped up and continued or restarted parenting children, you know, that they have. And so they've done some really positive strengths-based things. But with those things, even with stepping into those roles, then there are, you know, risk factors related to your mental health. I mean, you know, interacting with your children who you may not have been around as often as you would like. You know, how are those relationships going? Finances, you know, sort of understanding, you know, who is that person, who is FICA, you know, who keeps taking you know, who's FICA? You know, and so, you know, just working through some of those things. And, you know, we could characterize them as mental health issues, we could characterize them as risk factors, we could characterize them as growing pains. But, you know, I think it's a different set of circumstances because, you know, as athletes who, you know, have sort of stepped up and done some things they don't normally do or they don't do as often, but they also come with challenges. So I think that those are important to remember. And then the last thing, and we spoke with this, you know, I host with Dr. Keno Miller from Tulane and Brad Hambrick, who works in athletics at Georgia. Have a group of Black males that we meet with on Fridays. And yesterday we talked about a very interesting sort of dynamic. Black male athletes who love being at home and really want to get back to their sport, but also dread that transition that they know that's going to happen mentally and physically when they get back on campus. So, you know, you think about that, man, I got to leave home. I'm getting to go back to my sport. Oh, man, but I know it's going to be hard. And so, you know, that's a unique challenge as well.
Yeah. And I want to add to that with Emmett and that sense of community in some of the work that I've done and in talking with other women. I mean, Black women, we come from this collectivist type reality. And so being home and learning from mom and talking to mom and building that sisterhood are very positive things. So they're able to sort of reconnect in this moment. And hopefully, I guess my challenge to them is to even reach out to their teammates and continue that collectivist nature and sisterhood, which is one of the things that I did with my teammates and that we continue to kind of keep on. So hello to my sisters and brothers out there from an athletic standpoint. But there is some positive that can be found within when we talk about the intersection of race and gender for Black women in particular that come from that collectivist mindset, that sisterhood, that community other mothering, that conversations that you have with mom and grandma are things that can also continue to strengthen and build them as they prepare to go back to school.
And that brings me to a question that I have for both of you, who I've admired since I was a grad student at UT and a member of NAS, and just thinking about how much work you've done as mentors and thinking about, like, what does mentorship look like now that we're in the throes of COVID-19 with all of this uncertainty about what our campus lives are going to look like in August, September, October, November? Like, what do we do? Like, now as a faculty, I feel even more responsible as a woman who does work on sports, especially on Black women in sport, and just thinking about what it is that we can do at this time to kind of offer that extra level of care for our student athletes who go through so much? And I just would love to hear from both of you.
I think of it in the sense of I was in a conversation a couple days ago that said, we're not on the front lines, but we're on the second line.
Yeah.
In the sense that we have an opportunity to communicate with our young people. One of the things I would suggest from a mentorship perspective is, reaching out to those young people. And it may not be obviously through Zoom, but picking up the phone. I'm texting some of those mentors that I work with, or mentees that I work with. But in addition, taking the time to apprise yourself, get some of that training, understand some of the challenges, join some of these webinars to learn about some of the cultural nuances with Black women and Black men to better provide support. And it may even be suggesting, joining some of these webinars, these groups that Dr. Gill has to really help shore them up. Obtaining mental health first aid training. Again, we're not on the front line, but if we can recognize those signs and symptoms and work to connect and communicate and get the supports that those young people need, that's going to be a really big factor. And lastly, I'll say just having that empathy. I mean, I'm in my household homeschooling. And so one of the things, that I do with the students that I even teach from a day-to-day basis is when I would get on the call with them for classes, I just spent the first 30 minutes, how are you doing? And just went around just to ask, how are you doing? Again, from that human perspective, what's going on? Where are you? Some of them are talking to me through, in their cars, because that's the only quiet space that they have. But if you really try to get in and understand their human condition, that's going to begin to build some trust and communication, so you can start to get at the other things and talk about those other issues, to include life challenges and FICA.
Yeah, I think, Akila said it well. I don't know how much I can add to that, except to say that, if I were in the classroom in the fall and our professor, or I'd even step back and say, if I were a department head, I'd pull my faculty together and say, what space do you have in your syllabus, to sort of carve out, to deal with the return of students to school, and if there's no space that you can sort of say, okay, if you're teaching Monday, Wednesday, Friday, can you carve out a Monday and just make that Monday about transitioning back to school?
Right.
And if you don't have that space on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, then I'd say, the first 10 or 20 minutes, we need to carve out time to have conversations, about what we're going through, because, it's not, once we return to campus, then there's this new normal, there's no more shaking hands necessarily. We're going to be wearing masks. There's going to be social distancing in class. And so we really need to have a conversation about how that all plays out.
Right.
Secondly, I think the thing that I would be doing is, if I were a faculty member, I'm going to really have to be transparent about what I've gone through, in terms of COVID-19. We've seen various commercials. The one that I like the most is the one with the NFL. I think Tony Gonzalez starts it off, and Deion Sanders comes in there, and there are a lot of guys in between. But they say that we're all in this together.
Yes.
And if we are truly all of this together, then we were all impacted and will continue to be impacted in very unique and intersectional ways. And we need to have those conversations. It would be neglect for a faculty member to walk into a classroom and not share something on a weekly basis about how COVID is impacting them. I would just, really encourage, faculty to think about that, whether you're engineering, whether you're sport management, whether you're exercise, science and kinesiology, or whether you're sociology. We have to, it's what Akila said, it's empathy, and it's teaching our kids about self-compassion, because we really are not going to see some of the after effects, some of the negative consequences of COVID and the return to COVID until the spring semester, next summer semester, into next fall. But those are the two things that I would think about.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then on top of that, with what else has been going on recently, not just in terms of COVID, but also just sort of like these societal traumas. Since we talked about trauma earlier, when we saw Ahmaud Arbery, or what we saw with Breonna Taylor, the feeling of, okay, I'm going back to campus, I'm going back to school, but am I safe? Not just from the virus, but from, being profiled or being hunted down in some way. And Emmett, you wrote an excellent op-ed recently that talked about sort of the responsibility that athletic directors and athletic departments and others can take on, in terms of being able to respond adequately to these types of traumas that exist. And this is a question for both of you. What else could be done at this point on the part of athletic directors, athletic departments, to really acknowledge all of these intersecting traumas in order to support the athletes?
I really, and I appreciate the shout out on the op-ed, Zach. I think that, and we talked about this a couple of weeks ago about, sort of a mental health training camp for athletes once they return to campus. I mean, if I'm an athletic director and I'm getting my men's and women's basketball and football back on campus, and I'm throwing them into the weight room and into meetings and into the training table, there's a certain risk there in terms of mental health. I would say the first 3 to 4 days, even maybe the first week, while we might do some light things, most of it's going to be working on you, because you think about it, we're bringing kids back to a campus where there's going to be no professors. There's probably going to be nobody on campus besides the people who are just helping with the upkeep of campus. So just that in and of itself, is going to be different for our student athletes and a different challenge for them. So, I've advocated for this mental health training camp where we just, give them some time to get acclimated, listen to their stories, talk to them. I think that the most successful, and I like what Lincoln Riley is thinking about at Nebraska. I mean, he's really thinking about the implications. But I think that we're going to see those programs that take time out to really help transition their student athletes back. They're going to benefit in ways, whether it's the department GPA, whether it's APR scores, whether it's graduation success rates, whether it's wins and losses on the field. They're going to benefit. Some of those folks who are going to have their kids back on campus on the 27th of May or the 1st, if they don't help those kids transition, I think that those are the kids that we're going to see in the news, and those are the programs that aren't going to do necessarily well on the field or in the classroom.
And I'll just add something real quick. And having these athletic departments, think about if you don't have a sports psychologist, it's time to get one.
Yeah.
If you have not built a system of allies, of faculty and staff that can engage with, and that those students can engage with to come in with during this time frame, it's going to be a good benefit because they're going to build a relationship with them during those time frames. And then when they do have an issue, a challenge, it won't be go see Dr. Carter Francique. You will already know who I am, and we built that relationship. And so when they have those moments, they'll be more likely and inclined and willing to say, hey, can we talk? So again, making sure they get a sports psychologist on staff, if not have one already, and bringing in faculty and staff that can serve as allies to support those young men and women through this transition process. So when they do have challenges, they're able to just release and share.
And I'll just piggyback off that right quick. And Zach, the field that we're in addition to the sports psychologist, Akila, licensed professional counselors, counseling psychologists, clinical psychologists. And of course, we've got about 25 social workers working in Division I college athletics. And more importantly, we know now, all right, so we got athletic directors taking pay cuts. We got coaches taking pay cuts. So it's not like the money isn't there and we're not. I mean, we've got folks who are cutting 8, 10, 20 million or plus off of their payroll. So for them to spend, 60, 70, $80,000 to bring in a mental health practitioner and say multiply that times 4, $350,000, or it's just for the first semester to get them off the ground. It's totally within play right now, and it's totally financially feasible. It always boggles my mind how, athletic departments think that they're going to get these student athletes to physically perform when their heads aren't right. It doesn't.
It's symbiotic relationship.
It really
That's
doesn't.
Yeah,
make
it doesn't
sense.
work.
Yep.
Yeah.
It doesn't work.
Bring in somebody to do visualization or mindfulness as a sports, but they're worried about their mom or dad who might be susceptible to COVID, or they're worried about their
grandma.
Yeah.
Or
Exactly.
the mortgage, you paying the mortgage, but you want them to focus on this cover too. It just doesn't work like that. And so the money's there and the diversity and practitioners are there. We just need to get them into the athletic department.
Right.
Thank you both.
Thank you
for everything that you shared. This has been an amazing conversation, and I look up to both of you. And so thank you again for being here.
Same
We're going to transition.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you to our last conversation. So we will see you both later. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. Anytime you get to listen to Emmett and Akila, it's just truth to power, and their expertise is so, absolutely, just so appreciated. And so leading into our final topic for this event, really looking at sort of mental health after a playing career is finished, particularly in the professional realm. And really looking at what that can look like. So we'll bring in our guests for today. We have here Karen Winston, and we also have Dawn Anderson Butcher, and we also have our friend Reggie back again. Thank you all for joining us.
Hi, it's great to see all of you. And so I guess I'll just jump in with my first question is that transitioning in general out of professional sports into the new world is tough on its own. And now we're living in the age of COVID-19, and that has completely changed the landscape. And so one of the questions that I have is, how do we help athletes kind of make that move and to adjust to their new reality beyond playing the games that they've loved so much, whether it be forced out by injury or, retirement because they're just ready? I'd love to hear from any of you who would like to speak first.
I'll take it first, I guess.
Okay, great.
You guys can say something smarter after me. But I'm so sorry. Could you repeat the question one more time?
No, just thinking about like the transition out of sports into society beyond the game that you've played, the game that you've loved, whether it be voluntary or involuntary due to injury or other issues.
Okay. Yeah, I just think when it comes to that, getting the transition started as soon as possible. I've heard someone say, start transitioning as soon as college football starts. But you have to really start the transition as early as possible. They say it to you. I remember when I was playing my rookie year, they do say it early, but it's something the earlier you can do it, the better. Because it's not just one thing that's changing. Your whole world changes into something else. And to be able to combat those things, you can definitely do yourself a huge favor by getting it started as early as possible.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I have seen professional athletes transitioning into the NFL and out of all the professional sports for about 28 years. And my experience is they wait quite a long time to really start addressing the transition because they're trying to figure it out on their own. And often what I see is by the time they come in to see me, they really suffered a long time by themselves. And that's heartbreaking for me because there's so much help. And I understand all of us want to try to transition on our own. But I wish there was a way we could help people normalize getting help in the transition sooner.
Definitely.
I'm going to chime in a little bit. I appreciated Reggie's comment about transitions. I think what we do at Ohio State is we preload a lot of work while our student athletes are here on campus to make sure that they are not just thinking about what's going on in the here and now as a college student athlete, but the other kinds of skills that they need, the life skills and leadership skills and time management skills. So we've embedded a lot of programs into our athletic department and the student athlete experience that make a lot of difference. I'm not sure if people are familiar with the Real Life Wednesdays program that Coach Stamp does here. And the whole, I always laugh because it's like, what is every other day, not real life, here on campus for our student athletes. But at any rate, in those programs like Real Life Wednesday, through our student athlete support services office, they're doing a lot of groups and classes and journaling and goal setting and individualized education plans that are helping student athletes not just think about how they're doing on the field, but kind of prepare for post-college athletics or post the pros. And really, really important work that happens, and it can never happen soon enough to support those healthy transitions.
Definitely. And that leads to my question that I have is really looking at, and this is a question for all of you, really just looking at what ways that folks can take really tangible steps to make sure that we as a community or communities in general can help in that transition period beyond sports. So how can communities, and that can include family, friends, etc., how can they create room for athletes to really make that transition out of professional life?
Well, I have a question actually about that for Reggie. So I was with the Texans for 13 years. And my experience, and Reggie, I'll be so curious what your thoughts are, but we would bring in people from the community to talk about, and our player engagement director did this, to talk about different fields people might be interested in. What I found over and over is that went very, very well. But also, you're so focused on keeping your job, Reggie, as you talked about earlier. You just got to stay so locked in. It's hard to start thinking about what's next when you're all in. And so I wish that we could think about how to be in touch with every guy that transitions out, whether the team is in touch, the organization is in touch, about saying, how can we support your transition? I imagine the players trust us that, or the PA. But I think there's still something more we can do. And Reggie, maybe you can help us think about that.
Yeah, I've thought about this a lot, actually, especially because with football, I love football. I love what it gave me, but I never really considered myself rah, ball is life, football's the only thing that matters. Like, no, I was good at it and I liked it a lot, and it was amazing. But even me transitioning out of it, it's so difficult because a lot of the questions that you need to be answering, you have to start that. I say beginning of college, but you need to start that as early as possible. Because how I compare it to is, say you're just a normal student and you graduate from college. You're 22, 23, and how many 22, 23-year-olds know what they really want to do out of things? How many people change careers after a couple of years? It's a lot of people. But when I got done, I was 27 years old. I had played football. I had been consumed with only football for so many years. I tried a lot to try to figure out what I wanted to do. But you literally have to understand that every minute that I give outside of ball hurts me inside of ball.
Yes.
And this is it. It's my only shot.
That's right.
So I would put it to the off seasons, and then in the off season you got to train. And every minute I'm not trained, that's hurting me in football. So you don't have the time to do it. You have to really answer these things as early as you can in a process. Because the thing that you really have to understand is, who are you outside of football?
Yeah.
Who are you really? What are you? It's such a fun. You got to understand the fundamentals of yourself, the bare bones of what you are and what you're not, and you don't have that idea. It takes years to figure it out.
So when do you think is the time in a pro career, since we're talking about after pro career, that there is the mental space, the bandwidth to even start that process? Because I would say the first 3 years, I have not really experienced the men ready to kind of think about what's next.
No way.
Right.
No way.
Yeah, I'm with you, because if you bring that up, like, what's next or who are you? They stare at you like, are you kidding? I'm just trying to stay here as long as I can.
Yeah, I just felt that anxiety.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So this is the dilemma, though, because you're exactly right. Who am I outside of football? And what's next for me? When does that start?
Well, the thing that I've thought about, the thing that probably had the biggest impact on me was when I talked to former players who had already gone through it and they were around. Because it's not like college where you'll have former guys there every now and then. On an NFL team, you know, like when I played for the Chargers, like Kellen Winslow is not going to walk in one day and be like, hey, what's up, guys? Like, I'm going to give you guys the game. No, it doesn't work that way. But having guys who have already gone through it come back and help the players. I think it's called like being a peer support specialist.
Yeah.
Like trained peer support, trained specialist. Because they've already gone through it. You're in a situation where you're in a world of snakes, and these guys trust no one except other guys who've done it. Because you got to understand, friends change, family members change, the public is what it is, media is what it is. You're in a world of yourself, and the only people who can talk to you are other players. So having peer support trained specialists working with these guys in the transitions, it would be phenomenal. That's why I went and got trained to do it, because once I realized that existed, I was like, well, this is a thing. Because the thing that I knew I needed the most when I played was some guy who had already gone through it, already been where I was at, and that I could hit up and say like, hey, I'm going through this. What can I do? How did you get through this? How did you manage having 2 full-time jobs as a college athlete? And how did you do it and still have a social life? How do you do it? And you're there with me every day. And you're there just to help me with that, my life, with what's going on in here. You get it. I know if all people are going to get it, it's going to be you. And as far as like having to build up that level of trust, it's not going to be how it would be with like a therapist who, you know, studied, you know, the mind for 8 years. It's not going to be that. I can let down my guard with you because I know you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'd like to add something, Reggie. I appreciated those comments. I think what happens a lot to our pro athletes that are here in Columbus is they had identities as Buckeyes, right? And they what they do is they come back here to Columbus and they show up in our training rooms and they're in our gyms shooting hoops with the current team, or connecting with, you know, players that they, you know, played with years ago just when they come on campus. And then they've created these nice little networks outside of sports, but in their own social systems that continue to thrive on that identity as Buckeyes, but also help each other collectively within their career pathways. And so it's not as formalized as what you're saying in terms of a peer support staff person or whatnot, but it definitely does happen. Post-athlete to post-athlete, old coach to previous athlete. And then I've seen some of our most successful people who have transitioned from pro to be really super engaged as leaders in the Columbus community. And I think they've found a really great way to give back and use their persona and their electricity and their power to do just that. I have a great example, Katie Smith, past Buckeye WNBA player, right? She was out with us last week distributing sports in the bag to 500 kids in Logan, her old community, and also in the urban part of Columbus. But she does those things regularly as part of her transition out of sport, but to keep in sport and also to stay connected to the university. So if we can figure out ways to make meaningful opportunities for folks to come back, to their hometowns or their institutions or their professional, teams that they play for, and have meaningful roles that continue outside of just being on the playing field, I think it can be really a great way to help transition smoothly. Plus, we can keep our eyes on them and, be there or if they need somebody to call, right? And help them get further intervention as needed if they need it, right?
Definitely. I just want to say thank you all for being a part of this panel. And I want to thank all of our panelists from our different segments, from trauma to race and gender to mental health after going pro, to those of you that have been watching via YouTube and sending your questions and comments. We appreciate you so, so much. This topic of athletes and mental health is so important, especially now as we're making these transitions into what will probably be completely different seasons that we've seen before COVID existed. And I just want to shout out our producer, Marisa. You've been great. And of course, our wonderful CEO, Joe Cardoso. Thank you for all that you do at Nuts and Bolts Sports. This has been absolutely amazing. I'm Dr. Letitia Brown, and thank you, Zachary, for being a wonderful co-host. And we hope that you have a wonderful, wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.